So I'm the CISO at John Lewis. I've been there 2 years now. For those of you who don't know who John Lewis is, shame on you. We have a Christmas advert out. Please go and watch it. So we have a large retail environment and an online presence. We also sell some financial services products as well, insurance. We have a partnership credit card as well, which is underpinned for us by HSBC. So we have lots of challenges within that sort of information security space. So, the GDPR, what is it? So, it's a new EU regulation on how we handle information related to individuals. It's going to come into force from the 25th of May 2018. In fact, it's actually in force now, but there are no penalties or requirements to comply until the 25th of May 2018. And we've got it replaces the UK Data Protection Act. Okay? So, I could have just done one slide. So what is the Brexit effect? So by the time we trigger Brexit, and by the time Brexit actually happens, it will take longer than it will before this act comes into force. So we will be subject to the GDPR, even if we then do actually trigger the Brexit. Okay? So that means for a period of time we are going to be covered by the regulation. That being said, going forward, it's still going to apply to us regardless of whether or not we trigger Brexit. So some of the bigger implications, in order to freely receive data around the EU, we're going to have to implement something similar to the GDPR. And the view generally is that we are going to enact pretty much all of the GDPR regulations. Some of the smaller things we need to consider: if, as a business, you deal with any EU citizens or hold data on an EU citizen, you will be subject to the GDPR, regardless of whether you actually trade in Europe or not. How does data privacy protection and security come together? I'm sure if I asked everyone in this room, they could all come up with slightly different variations of the interlocking circles, Venn diagrams, or some such variation of. So data protection, that's the framework that sets out by the GDPR, and that says what can we do with people's information and individuals. I was slapped over the knuckles by our data privacy officer because I kept referring to it as PII, and he said, no, that's the Americans, please don't use that anymore. Data privacy, so this is the aspects of the data protection framework, ensuring that the individuals have their control over how the data is used. There are a number of, and data security sort of sits at the heart of this, and as an information security professional, I would say this is the key to all of this. So this is about how we keep that information safe, how we keep it confidential, and to use the traditional security threefold approach of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I think all three of those aspects are key to the GDPR and that interaction. So, I won't go into all of these in detail. That would be a very, very long presentation, and lasting the day isn't the time to do that. So, I've highlighted a couple of these on the three slides I've got that cover these. So the first thing is, if your business is not in the EU, you'll still have to comply with that regulation. I mentioned this beforehand as well. So this is where you have data on EU citizens. You need to comply. And in fact, as it happens, some of the EU countries have already enacted this legislation into their own laws. So Germany is one of those. So in fact, if you hold data on German citizens at the moment, theoretically, you can be prosecuted for not complying with the GDPR.
Do you mind if I ask a question?
Go ahead.
So this is for employee data as well, I guess?
Yes.
It's not only
It's irrelevant whether it's employee or customer, as long as it can identify an individual, it counts. The definition of personal data is much more broad than it was before. So this includes things like genetic identity, economic identity, social identity as well. So it increases the range much more than it was in the past. One of the ones that I haven't called out so much here, but it's going to be an issue for retailers, I think, as one particular example. So consent being necessary to process children's data. So the Act talks about you need parental consent to process data for children under the age of 16. Okay, that's quite different. Now, EU member states can lower that to as low as 13, okay, if they want to. This has some implications. So in theory, if you have a child who's 12, so under the 13 age limit, who has their own bank account and wants to buy something online, in theory, the retailer can't process that child's personal data without the parent saying, yes, they can buy. Now that could have big implications. I don't think it will, but I think retailers have got to start thinking about how they're going to handle that. The rules for obtaining valid consent are going to change, so it should be very simple, and a lack of action does not constitute consent, which it has in the past, and lots of companies have got away with that. Data protection officer appointment is mandatory for certain companies. So it will be dependent on the size of the organisation, but you will be required to have not necessarily a dedicated person, but there will be a dedicated role to take on that of a data protection officer. And that's something we've done within John Lewis. So we've appointed a data privacy officer, we've called them. That person reports to our CFO and has a level of autonomy and independence that means that he can get on with his job. The data protection officer, it's highlighted that this person cannot be made redundant or fired for doing their jobs. If they disagree with your board and say they've got to do something different, the board can't go, we don't like that, we'll get rid of that person. Okay. Introduction of mandatory privacy risk impact assessment. So this may be something you're already doing, but it's now you have to adopt a risk-based approach before you undertake any sort of what they call higher risk data processing activities. And you must be able to demonstrate these if you're ever questioned. As always, things like these regulations don't specify what constitutes higher risk. That's down to you as an organisation as part of your risk profile to determine what is higher risk. Okay. Data breach notification. I'm going to come onto this on the next couple of slides as well. So there are now new requirements for notifying the regulators of any data breaches, and the notice must be made within 72 hours. And I'll come on to talk about this in a bit more in a couple of slides. The right to be forgotten. You may well have seen a number of cases where people have asked Google to remove references to them and asked to be forgotten. And in fact, even within John Lewis, we've been approached by customers who've asked to be forgotten from us, and that's causing us a number of challenges in terms of just identifying where all the data relating to that customer sits and resides. Okay. The international transfer of data. So again, this is going to have the impact of this is if we aren't part of the EU longer term, then do we become like the US and we need a privacy shield agreement to allow data transfer between ourselves and the rest of the EU, or do we become someone like Switzerland, which has an agreement with the EU to transfer data? I think at the moment that's unclear. Data processor responsibilities. So the data processor will have direct legal obligations and responsibilities, so that processors can also be liable for data breaches. So in the past it was the controller, and the processor didn't have that. What this means is now there's going to have to be much tighter contractual arrangements between the controller and the processor, so there can be equal liability, and you could find that the contract becomes more expensive for some of the people you're asking to process data for you. Portability, so moving them between one electronic system and another. I won't cover that too much now. Privacy by design. So we've used the expression within John Lewis of security by design for a number of years. Privacy by design builds on that as well. So this is from the start when you're designing a new system that's going to hold and process data. You know, you shouldn't be, privacy shouldn't be a bolt-on. It should be the number one concern. So your developers, when they're designing the system, should be having that as part of their requirements from day one. A one-stop shop. So this means there's going to be a single or supervising authority for each one of the 28 member states. In our case, that's going to be the ICO. It's going to be interesting how those regulators are going to fund themselves, because now that they are not, some are government funded, some are non-government funded, so you may well see certain regulators wanting to impose larger fines than others to help keep themselves going as well. So we've talked about the GDPR. So what is the role for information security? Well, as an IS professional, my role is to protect an organisation's information assets. So in John Lewis's case, and how it relates to the GDPR, this is personal information or sensitive personal information covered under the current Data Protection Act. So this means you need to work very closely with our compliance officers, our data protection officers, and our audit teams. This has got to be a much more collaborative approach than maybe has happened in the past. It's always been a question of them and us. The auditors, it's okay? In the past, you've seen data privacy or data protection teams, audit teams, compliance and InfoSec teams working much more in silos, maybe interacting at certain times where the auditors come along and want to see how you're working, whether you comply with your policies and good practice. You need to have a much more joined up approach now, and that's what the GDPR is going to be looking for. So within John Lewis, what we've done is we now have a single team that comprises information security and data privacy. So we've merged those two teams together. And that means that when we're doing things like privacy impact assessments, they're being done alongside the information security impact assessments at the same time. So we're building joint policies covering data privacy as well as information security. So the two things now linked together. Having a collaborative approach and coordinating what you're doing means you've got less chance of things being missed. So if one team thinks they're doing this and one team thinks they're doing this, you're going to find there's something that gets left in the middle. So if you're working together, each of you can be able to call out those things. And the last statement on the slide there, so compliance will come naturally. It will magically happen. But by having that joined up approach, it will be a much easier process. So the specific information security requirements that come out of the GDPR, and again, they're quite loose in terms of the definitions within the GDPR. So controllers are required to implement appropriate technical and organisational measures. And what the Act says is you have to take into account the state and the cost of implementation, the nature, scope and context of processing that information, and the risk and varying likelihood and severity for the rights and freedoms of natural persons. So nicely, clear, succinct, and not entirely open to interpretation at all. There are certain things that the GDPR does suggest around what security actions might be considered appropriate to your risk. So these will include one of my least favourite words, primarily because I can't pronounce it, but the pseudo-anonymization, I believe, and encryption of personal data. But again, it doesn't define what it means by pseudo-anonymization. And that's something where you need to work with your data protection officers to understand, actually, when you have a piece of information, what can you do to it so it can't be reverse engineered to come back to an individual? Even if it's things like a unique customer identity number. Randomly generated on its own means nothing at all to anybody. However, that, in conjunction with another piece of information you may or may not come into possession of, allows you to identify an individual. So technically, even a customer service number becomes personally identifiable information.
Sorry, Mike, it's worth saying there are two really good guides on the UK ICO website. In other words, what constitutes good practice, and the other one on encryption.
Yeah.
Both are actually really good, succinct reads.
Encryption of personal data. I'm sure many organisations, as did ours, in the wake of the TalkTalk breach, the default response was let's encrypt everything. And we had to convince our board and our chairman that the right-click select all encrypt option wasn't available to us and wasn't necessarily the right answer. However, there are certain cases where you have to encrypt data. So, coming out of personal data, when you're talking about card information, you can't hold that in your systems unless it's encrypted. Okay? But encryption can be the right answer in some cases, not always. You have to ensure the ongoing confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and resilience of processing systems and services. So that's key tenets of an information security function or strategy. you have to have the ability to restore the availability and access to personal data, so good backups. We heard backups being talked about earlier in the day, and this also presents its own challenges, because if you're being told to recover data as part of a subject access request or the right to be forgotten, you've got to remember to remove that data from the backups as well. So you've got a double-edged sword. You need to have that data to be able to restore it in the event of a problem, but at the same time, if somebody doesn't want their data being held by you anymore, you then have to be able to remove it from those backups as well. And regular testing, assessing and evaluating the effectiveness of your controls. So this is your classical vulnerability testing and your red teaming. We heard a bit earlier about King, who's got a red King organisation, who's got their own in-house red team as well. We don't within John Lewis. We use an external party for red team testing. And we've just run a series of red team tests which has highlighted a number of issues which we've gone slightly concerning. And I think it's a really good exercise to do, because traditional vulnerability testing highlights certain misconfigurations or patches missing. Red team testing is a bit of an eye-opener to anybody who's not done it before, and I would definitely suggest it's something to do. But again, it's something that shows you're taking this seriously. We talked about data breach notification. So I won't read it out, but basically, under the GDPR, a personal data breach is what they talk about. So this is where there's accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, etc. of personal data. You must notify the regulator without undue delay, and where feasible, not later than 72 hours. If you don't do this within 72 hours, there must be a reasonable justification of the delay. And again, reasonable hasn't been defined. It's down to you to discuss that with the regulator when you miss the 72-hour deadline. We, as InfoSec professionals, in that case, for organisations, have to ensure we have the ability to detect a breach. Now, the question is, can we do that within 72 hours? So currently in Europe, okay, we are slightly worse off than the rest of the world in terms of identifying breaches. So on average, it's 146 days for organisations to find attackers in the system. In Europe, as of, I think it was the end of mid-2016, it was over 460 days. So we have to notify within 72 hours, but on average it takes us a year and a month, or a year and 3 months. So we may have a slight misalignment between those two things. You also have to, where the risk to individuals is high, and again, this is not defined under the GDPR, what it means by high, but you have to then notify the data subjects themselves. So, for example, TalkTalk is the one I will always use. So TalkTalk had the data breach. They would have been, under the new regulations, required to notify all of their subjects. But again, it doesn't give a timescale. And TalkTalk did notify everyone who was affected as well. But it's no longer a question of down to the organisation to make that call. There are some exceptions about when you have to notify individuals. So where you can say you have implemented appropriate controls that render the data unintelligible to any person, such as encryption. So if you lose your customer database but it was encrypted, you are not obligated to notify your data subjects. I would think most people in this room, if they were involved in that situation, would think it was good practice and ethical to actually tell people it had happened, but the regulations say you don't have to do that. So also, if there's a breach, if we take actions that subsequent to the breach ensure that the high risk for the rights and freedoms is unlikely to materialise. Again, this is very subjective. What does that actually mean? And the regulator is going to scrutinise everything you do, any decision you make off the back of that. And the last one is where notification to each data subject would involve disproportionate effort. So this is rather than necessarily having to write to 10 million customers, you might take the decision to do a general notification on your website for people who come, series of FAQs, those type of things as well. But again, I think the ICO would have a lot to say about this and would expect you to make much more of a proactive effort to contact your customers. Everyone's favourite examples, and Tesco's were very helpful by having a breach only last week, so I could quote them on this one as well. So currently, the maximum fine is £500,000 for a data breach under the Data Protection Act. The ICO can hand out that fine. Under the new regulations, Tesco's potential fine was £1.9 billion. Now, the bank itself only has a turnover of just under £1 billion, but it's the parent group that the fine is based on, so it's up to 4% of the revenue of the overall group. And their overall revenue was 48 billion last year. So, that alone, that's the turnover of the bank for 2 years, gone in a single fine. Now, I think a fine that somebody is going to be made an example of, I'm sure about that. It's also going to take years for that fine to materialise, because it will go through legal discussions and court cases and appeals and all sorts of things until somebody gets a decision. The other most recent one they talked about, so TalkTalk we all mentioned previously, fined 400,000. That's the biggest fine the ICO have ever given out, and it's the highest they can, it's the highest they've ever given, and 500,000 being a maximum. I think TalkTalk also got a discount for paying early as well. But again, that would have cost them £70 million under the GDPR on the same levels. Now, it's estimated that it's cost TalkTalk between 50 and 60 million to do all the remediation work off the back of this as well. So if you think they'd have had to do that, plus a £70 million fine, so that doubled what they've had to spend on top of that. The other thing is recently, the UK's new Information Commissioner has recommended, as part of a draft digital economy bill, that company directors should be held personally liable and accountable for data breaches. This currently doesn't exist in law, but it's been recommended, and I think that's something that the board would sit up and pay attention to if the chairman or your CEO suddenly thought, actually, in the event of a breach, as well as a big fine for the company, they would go to jail. So whether this actually happens, I don't know. I have a feeling it probably will. How soon? I think that's up for debate. The other thing I wanted to mention, and this is something that won't affect everyone in this organisation. In fact, it doesn't directly affect John Lewis. So this is the EU Directive on the Security of Network and Information Systems. Again, another short, sharp, snappy title the EU have come up with. Everyone refers to it as NIS. So this went through, I think it was July this year, off the top of my head, I can't remember. And this again is going to come into force in 2 years' time. So this primarily affects organisations that are part of the country's critical national infrastructure. So telecoms providers, electricity providers. There is a discussion on whether things like supermarkets are part of the critical national infrastructure, again, which would impact John Lewis potentially there. But at the moment it doesn't. But it will have an impact on those companies who are providing those services, and most of us in here deal with those companies as part of our day-to-day business. And again, it will be the same sort of thing that the GDPR has an effect on, in terms of even if we withdraw from the EU, it's going to take too much time to avoid these regulations coming into force. I think the first statement is really interesting. So this means that organisations that are covered by this regulation will need to adopt measures that manage risks coming from zero-day exploits and never seen before malware attacks. I mean, I think organisations are struggling to manage this as it is now without there being regulation that's saying they have no choice but to do it. What the impact of that's going to be in terms of what the organisation is going to have to do and what the ramifications will be if the organisation can't comply with it, I think is still unclear. And again, similar to the GDPR, EU member states are going to be obliged to pass domestic laws to apply its rules. And I think, as was announced week before last, there's been a, I can't remember the exact figure, 1 billion or 1.9 billion pound investment in cybersecurity in the UK. So I think this will be tied in closely with that as well. So in conclusion, GDPR's and InfoSec. So don't ignore it. If you trade in Europe, it's going to affect you. If you hold EU citizen data, it's going to affect you. The second one is somewhat slightly worrying. I was at a meeting about a month ago, and somebody said, we're just going to wait and see what happens to somebody else. Now, maybe they'll be lucky, but maybe they will be the somebody else, and then by then it's a bit too late. So don't ignore it. Don't wait until the first fine happens. You need to start doing things now. Brexit is not going to make a difference to this. Okay, we're still going to have to do this unless there's anybody here who can say they don't hold data on anybody who doesn't live in the UK. I think we're all probably, nobody would be 100% certain to say that. And encourage your stakeholders to work much more closely together. So, mentioned before, that's your data privacy teams, your compliance officers and your auditors as well. And also your board members. Get them on board. Make sure they understand what their obligations are. Make sure they know the ramifications, but also make sure they understand why this is a good thing and why that looking after personal data is key to an organisation and its reputation. There we go. Thank you.
Other questions? So, questions?
If we put post-Brexit to one side, then once GDPR comes into force in the UK in May 2018, is it a subsidiary, while the scale of the fine is on the group level, if the subsidiary has a breach, is that entity actually the liable element rather than the group? In other words,
if it's a separate legal entity, yes.
What's enforceable? So you could just, I suppose, take a business decision, you let that entity fall, and you save the group.
Yes, but you should have to pay the fine at the group level. But you could then just say,
How enforceable is it?
I think well, that's what the regulation says. How enforceable it is, somebody will test that in the courts, I feel. But you're right. There was an example of a company in the US where they just said it would have wiped out a small subsidiary's business for 3 years. So they would have said what we'd have done is just mothballed the business, binned it, and walked away from that one because they just couldn't afford to keep it going after that. But so the regulation says they will find the parent company. And I suppose that's all to do with company regulations and company law. So
For the Googles and the Amazons of this world who have a legal UK entity,
yeah,
and they just say, right, we'll walk out of the UK and goodbye, thank you very much. It's aimed to stop them doing that, or certainly threaten them.
yeah, absolutely.
What happens if it's an American company holding European data or a Russian one?
They still
How
have.
do they enforce it?
So they still have to, well, it's enforced by the regulator in the individual country in the EU. How that would work in practice, I don't think people know.
So when Britain, if it was outside the EU, not part of the single market, for example,
Yeah.
God forbid, it would be the same thing. We couldn't really enforce it into the UK.
No, but the Information Commissioner potentially, yes, a good point. No, the Information Commission could potentially enforce it because they could decide that the rights of the citizens. On behalf of
No, but when after Brexit done and
yeah,
Theresa May screwed everything up and we're completely outside Europe.
I think if the data are in the US, it would have been while we are still in the EU and there will be safe harbors and all this stuff in place, so you not put new data.
how the
Where's the stick? That's the thing, right? And there is still a stick. If you look at the Russian data protection law, which just came in recently, they've just banned LinkedIn in Russia. They've just blocked it. So no one in Russia at the moment can access LinkedIn because LinkedIn was storing Russian citizens' data outside of Russia. Now Europe can do the same thing. They can just say, Google, if you value your European business, you will pay this fine or you will comply or we will cut you off.
yeah, and they can stop the business trading in that country. So they can say if you're not going to pay the fine, you can no longer trade in this country. But how that's going to work in practical terms, I don't know.
Right, to be continued over drinks after the final session. But for the time being, Mike, thank you very much indeed.